to another episode of The Oath and the Office. I am John Fugelsang. I am so pleased to share this mic with one of our most incisive legal minds, Professor Corey Brettschneider, a professor of political science at Brown University, the author of The Oath and the Office, a guide to the Constitution for future presidents. The professor is also a regular contributor to Politico, The New York Times, The Atlantic. I can barely keep up with you, Corey. Welcome back. It's so good to see you.
Thanks, John. We're in the midst of a constitutional crisis. We're going to talk about the president essentially trying to rewrite the truth, eliminate statistics. We're going to talk, too, about the complicated and frightening prospect of Texas rewriting the electoral map and the question of whether or not there's a principled reason why California and New York should not fight back. Just a little preview. I think they absolutely should, as I know you do, too. And looking forward to those discussions and others on this episode. And thanks to the listeners who have subscribed. We are growing. Summer is supposedly a slow time for podcasts, but not for this one. We're getting rating after rating, 5 stars completely, which is very unusual when you're over, as we are, 325. And even though it's summer, the podcast is growing and growing. It's really taking off. People are spreading the news, sharing it. So thanks for that.
Well, there's a lot going on. It should be taken off. We're right now at a situation where numbers crunchers are getting fired for reporting stats. Brett Kavanaugh is publicly defending the shadow dockets. Prosecutor Jack Smith's getting prosecuted. Jeanine Pirro, conspiracy theorist, is getting a promotion. And the most famous sex trafficker in America is getting a spa day. Corey, Ghislaine Maxwell gets to go to a nice prison with cucumber in the water. It's so nice. But let me start off by asking you about Texas's escalating gerrymandering plans and the growing response from blue states like California and New York. Texas, as we know, is preparing to double down on aggressive mid-decade gerrymandering because Como over Caligula publicly demanded it. And they're just doing it all out in the open now. They are tired of voters being able to choose their politicians, and these politicians want to be able to choose their voters, Corey. So California and New York are now considering using their own political power to redraw lines in ways that benefit the Democratic Party. You've said in the past, we have to fight for democracy, not just norms. So, Professor, is it time for Democrats to stop pretending to be above the fray?
Look, norms are important, but what's as important certainly are the basic democratic procedures that allow us to have electoral contests that are fair and true. And what gerrymandering is, and partisan gerrymandering, which I'm going to talk about, is I mean, without question, just an attempt to undermine that process, to turn it into something that looks like democracy, but is anything but. I need to bring up Andor, even though we're so early in the show. What's brilliant about that show...
It's never too early to bring up Andor, Corey. Let's do it. Let's do it.
I mean, what's so amazing about that show is that it's people who are living under an obvious tyranny to the viewer, but many of them believe that they're living in a republic still. And that's a just way of saying that you can have a Senate, you can have the vestiges of a republic, but live in tyranny. And I don't want to overstate it, but this is not overstating it. If Texas gets away with this and other Republican states get away with it and it's unchecked, there is no sense in which we live in a democracy because the process will have been completely rigged in favor of one party. There was a recognition by scholars and academics and activists and constitutional lawyers that the danger of what's called partisan gerrymandering, there's different kinds of gerrymandering. The Supreme Court, for instance, has said in a case called Reynolds versus Sims that drawing districts in a way that overwhelmingly benefit rural and in particular white voters over urban and often predominantly black voters in the case that I'm talking about. That's you can't do that because the Equal Protection Clause has a guarantee of one person, one vote. So that idea of equal protection, one person, one vote, many activists and litigators said, we've got to expand that. And we've got to recognize that when the Republican Party is drawing maps, or the Democratic Party for that matter, it's not just one party that tries this, in a way that intentionally tries to block out the other party, that's unconstitutional. It's a violation of one person, one vote. It's diluting votes and undermining democracy. But the Supreme Court 6 years ago put a stop to what should have been a moment of saying you can't do that. And that's opened the way for Texas to now blatantly say, yeah, we're engaged in partisan gerrymandering. And of course, as we'll talk about, the question is what to do about it.
Well, can you talk about this idea of symmetrical disarmament? I didn't know there was a term for what these Democrats are trying to do, but there is. Is it dangerous, Professor, for blue states to gerrymander in response? Or is that really the only way to preserve a fighting chance at any kind of majority rule?
Look, I think as a matter of course, what should have happened as a matter of principle is that the Supreme Court should have said this partisan gerrymandering is not allowed. Now we're in a not an ideal world, far from it. What do we do if Texas engages in it? How do we respond? It's not going to be through litigation. That just simply will not work. It's a waste of time. And everybody who knows this issue knows it. So we've got to find alternatives. And what the governor of California and the governor of New York have rightly said is that we're going to fight back. How are we going to fight back? We also can control districts, and to the extent that Texas is going to gerrymander in favor of Republicans, we can do the same proportionally, I believe is the idea, in favor of Democratic seats. Now, that would seem totally unprincipled if Texas hadn't acted first, or they haven't done it yet, but weren't threatening to act first. But absent the Supreme Court's ability to intervene, I don't really see another way to stop this. And by the way, we're not talking about local legislatures. It would be one thing if we were talking about the state legislature of California and gerrymandering within California or within New York. We're talking about the national scheme that has to overall guarantee one person, one vote. And if the Supreme Court's not going to protect it within Texas, we've got to think about the national map. And so that's what I think they're doing, is rightly threatening a retaliation in order to preserve the principle of democracy.
And there's no meaningful federal check left, right, on gerrymandering. I mean, are there any constitutional limits on it after the Supreme Court's 2019 Rucho v. Common Cause decision?
No, I think that
Right.
what that case says is we're not going to get involved in this, and you know what to do. The court, obviously, that's the answer. The Constitution of the United States enshrines the idea of democracy in two words. It's in the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War. Of course, America is not a full democracy before the Civil War. Colonial America is not a full democracy. It has slavery, far from equal protection. But Frederick Douglass introduces this term, uses it in his speeches again and again, equal protection. And what the 14th Amendment does, and to my mind, the two most important words of the Constitution. We've talked about other important phrases, but these are the two most important words. It enshrines it in the 14th Amendment. Now, one person, one vote is part of that. And the court has said that repeatedly, but somehow, miraculously, this court, which is just an enabler of the destruction of democracy, the Roberts Court, has refused to enforce it. So where else are we going to get it? It's not going to be through legislation. And any
No.
legislation that's being contemplated at the national level would just enforce partisan gerrymandering. Instead, what we're going to get is nothing unless this plan is hatched. So I just think there's no alternative that's serious on the table.
Corey, here's the thing about all this. The gerrymandering case, it just seems so desperate on their part. And I've been saying on Sirius XM, stop and smell the train wreck, because this is a clear sign they're trying this hard to cheat this early in Texas, of all places. I mean, beyond the fact that this has such incredible whiffs of desperation to it, these state level battles, they totally affect our national representation, particularly in the House. And by extension, this stuff affects whether federal laws on abortion or guns or voting rights ever have a real chance. I mean, what's happening in Texas right now affects everyone outside of Texas.
Yeah, and you know, the podcast is called The Oath in the Office because we are focused on the office of the president in many of our episodes, the president who takes an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He's doing the opposite here. He's urging Texas, you know, that's where this is coming from, to cheat, essentially, and to use the fact that the Supreme Court won't enforce the law to take advantage of the weakness in American democracy, which has room for this partisan gerrymandering. So absent that, you know, what's at stake is everything. And you mentioned issues that are at stake. I'll also mention the most obvious one, which is obvious to our viewers, which is that this president is threatening democracy itself with his attack on non-citizens, his denial of any basic rights of citizens, including the right to free speech, saying non-citizens don't enjoy it, the right to due process. This is an assault on democracy, and what better way to do that, to carry it out, to be successful, and to have the vestiges, by the way, of a republic, but not an actual republic, but to redraw the maps. One of the weird anomalies in the American system, of course, and viewers might be thinking about this, is that the Senate, of course, is not one person, one vote. There's massive overrepresentation for small states.
That's true.
And so the court had to handle that in the Reynolds v. Sims case. And they said, look, this is something that's embedded in the Constitution. It is clearly undemocratic. But absent that, the principle of equal protection, which comes after the creation of the Senate, demands democracy in as many places as we can get it. And while that's embedded in our system, the lack of one person, one vote in the Senate, at least we have it, according to the Equal Protection Clause, as the court puts it, in the House of Representatives. So if that's lost through partisan gerrymandering, we really don't have a democracy at all. We start to look much like that example that I gave you of Andor, where you have an empire with vestiges of a republic or a monarchy. That looks like a republic but isn't one. And this is
absolutely,
we are teetering, and this is in some ways our last legs.
I want to give some shout outs to the Democrats in Texas who are organizing and coordinating and inspiring this resistance. I mean, and these governors in Illinois and New York and California who are calling out the cheating and saying, if Texas wants to rig democracy, we'll rewrite the rules too. I mean, we keep saying, when are the Democrats going to fight back? They're doing it. And when a party has to order the arrest of lawmakers or fine them for skipping work or threaten to replace them with their own cronies just to pass a rigged map, that's not confidence, that's panic. That to me sounds like a lot of terrified Republicans in Texas who shouldn't be so terrified. But if you want to understand who's really scared, don't look at the Democrats fleeing the state. Look at the people running the state government who are so terrified they're willing to shred every norm and every law just to stay in power. They're trying to cheat 18 months early, Professor. I mean, you don't gerrymander this hard unless you know you're losing.
That's right. They see what's coming. And, one of the points of our podcast, and the thing that I hear from listener after listener, and you could see it in these 323 reviews on Apple, is the hope. Where's the hope?
This podcast has a point? I didn't know. You never told me that was part of it.
Who ever heard of a podcast with a point? But the idea is I think we have 2 points. One is to tell the truth, and the other is to provide hope that we can prevail in the end, despite this assault on democracy. And, winning these midterm elections, which I think the Democratic Party is poised to do, will have serious consequences. It'll mean real oversight over these out-of-control, lawless agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, and of course ICE with its mass raids and its lawlessness. You and I have talked often about the need for a truth commission. That doesn't have to mean amnesty or anything like that, as it did in South Africa in too many cases, but it has to mean telling the truth. And the House of Representatives gaining control of the Democratic Party will elaborate on a lot of what's happening. Remember, of course, the January 6th committee and how much truth it brought out. And we need to do the same. They're petrified of that because once the truth comes out, it's not going to be good for them. There are other ways of stopping things. For instance, I do certainly favor impeachment again. And even if it doesn't work in terms of removal, if we don't have the votes in the Senate, it tees up the issues. And we heard Mike Sachs talk about his openness to that idea 2 weeks ago. So the person running against Lawler for Congress that we hosted. So yeah, I see why they want to cheat, because they're scared to death.
Yeah, they're scared of voters. And you know what else they're scared of? They're scared of data, Corey. Trump just fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because the jobs report was weak. You understand, Professor? His version of great job numbers is numbers that make his ego feel better, not numbers that reflect reality. Now, Erica McIntyre, career civil servant, confirmed by a bipartisan Senate vote with a whopping 86-8 margin. This woman's been like a trusted referee in the game of American economics. And Trump said that the numbers were phony. Like he fired her like she forgot his fries. Now, the it showed that July added only 73,000 jobs, way below expectation. Revised May and June jobs went downward by over 100,000 each. So, what this means is the economy's not booming. It is sputtering. It is gasping for air. The tariffs are not helping. People are not hiring. Trump doesn't like hearing it. And so he fires the messenger, literally. Corey, the whole country relies on the Bureau of Labor Statistics for reliable data. That's investors and policymakers and economists. And Trump relies on his feelings. Um, I almost don't know where to begin, Professor, but what is the constitutional danger when a president tries to take control of statistical agencies?
Look, I think that democracy, of course, involves one person, one vote, and those procedural protections that we talked about. It involves norms. But as important as those other two things, the third pillar, I'd say, is uh, truth, that it has to have access to information. That's the lifeblood of democracy. It relies on speech, the ability to speak and to say and to listen. But it also requires the citizenry to know the data, to know how things are happening, not just for their own well-being, but to make decisions about which leaders are serving us and which are undermining us. And the whole idea in a democracy is that information flow can't be controlled by some central figure. Now, I think that talking about norms, that we've just been too trusting, that of course no president would just fire somebody when they didn't like the information that was coming
No,
out.
no, it's
We were
unthinkable.
naive, and yet here it is. And to go back to the ideas at the most abstract level, what is a monarchist? What does an authoritarian need to do? They need to shut down truth. I need to fact check this, but I've heard it on pretty good authority that Ceausescu, dictator of Romania, at one point banned forms of higher math that he couldn't understand because he wanted to control the truth. Now, this is as absurd. It's just banning the truth about the basics of the economy. By the way, it's not just bad for democracy, it's bad for markets. How are markets supposed to
Yeah,
react if the information is controlled by the president for his own benefit? I wouldn't
that's
want to
it.
invest in a regime like that.
No, if you can't think about the poor people, think about the poor money. But here's what's crazy. The person who actually calculates the jobs data isn't even this woman, Ms. McIntyre. It's a team of over 2,000 career statisticians who have zero reason to lie. So Trump's firing one woman for something that comes from an army of professionals. And I guess, Corey, I shouldn't be shocked, but is this just about labor data, or is this part of something bigger? Could this be, like you say with Ceausescu, Trump laying the groundwork to control the government's entire understanding of what truth or reality or facts are if reelected? They're not going after language here, they're going after math. This is
Right.
2 + 2 is 5 stuff.
Right, exactly. And you've got to think about, in connecting the dots, which is what we're always doing. What are the other themes here? And the theme of disrupting the information flow to a democracy, you see it in this firing. By the way, there is resilience in the civil servants in that she's not the only person providing this data, but he's going to eventually, as he often does, figure out where the resistance is, what he calls the deep state, what is actually the revealing of truth, in this case of economic data, the civil service doing the job of democracy. And he'll try to cut that out too. If he can
Yes.
fire the head of it, he can reach into the agency and figure out who these other people are and control them too. That's what he's trying to do throughout the federal government. But think of what he's doing with the press, limiting access to who speaks in briefings, relying on Fox News, or if Murdoch turns on him, to Newsmax, and really trying to control the information flow. And the outright lying, really, that we've seen since Kellyanne Conway with her alternative facts, and that theme has just continued with this press secretary, just making things up. Remember, she talked about firing the Librarian of Congress. That the president did that because she let books out that were, somehow offensive, and not knowing that books aren't lent by the Library of Congress. It's just outright lying, and that's what this is all about. It's about
I'm
controlling the information flow and authoritarian flow and
you've
authoritarianism.
totally took me out of it, Corey. I'm sitting here trying to think of do I miss Kellyanne Conway? Do I miss her yet? Like I've so been pulled out of the narrative of whatever we're talking about. Like, do I miss her? If I don't miss her yet, are things really that bad? And now I'm terrified. Um, Corey, I know we have to get a break, but I just want to hammer this point home. This president and his obedient underlings are now saying the jobs numbers were rigged by the 121,000 businesses who report payrolls every month, and the hundreds of thousands of workers who clock in and out, and the millions of Americans trying to pay rent on $15 an hour wages. No evidence, just desperation. Historians are going to be embarrassed for all of us. But what protections, if any, still exist for the objectivity of agencies like the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Census Bureau or even the Department of Justice, right? I mean, if Congress wanted to, could they do anything preemptively here?
Uh, and we've got, look, this Congress won't do anything, but eventually we do have to ask that question. What should Congress do to shore up these protections, to ensure that a future president, or if we're successful in this election and overcome this challenge of Texas and partisan gerrymandering, the next Congress can begin this work? How do we start to, and by the way, at the end of Richard Nixon's tenure, the War Powers Act was passed. There were reforms that were made in the midst of the crisis. So that could happen in the second 2 years of his term. And what has to happen, I'll be very specific, is the shoring up of civil servants and their protection from firing. And we have mechanisms going back, way back in American history that do that. In fact, that's the older tradition that predates the powerful idea of the presidency, the unitary executive, that Congress could protect the civil servants in order to preserve things like the information flow. So think of the Federal Reserve Chair. Thankfully, he hasn't tried it, but the reason he hasn't tried to fire the Fed chair is because the Fed chair is protected from firing without cause. The head of the Federal Trade Commission is protected from firing without cause. Many civil servants under the Pendleton Act, lower level civil servants and mid-level, are protected from political firing. That idea, which is so embedded in American history going back to the 19th century, the late 19th century, when the Pendleton Act was passed and signed, we have to ensure that those civil servants are protected. And so that means in a future Congress, the protection of this agency, providing labor statistics and others like it.
We got to take a quick break, but there's so much I want to talk to you about, Professor, when we come back. I know you're getting more questions from listeners to explain what the shadow docket is, and that'll give us a chance to beat up on Brett Kavanaugh a bit, and that's doing the Lord's work. This is The Oath and the Office. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office podcast. I am John Fugelsang, humble henchman to Professor Corey Brettschneider. Professor, I understand that you got some mail over there from the listeners.
We do. We have Julie from Chicago asking a question. Julie wants to know if the shadow docket is a relatively new phenomenon, and she has some follow-up questions, basically asking us to elaborate on what this thing is. So what is the shadow docket? And I think it's a great question because we often hear things are unprecedented, and is it really? I mean, isn't this just something you can imagine the conservatives on the court? We're going to talk about Brett Kavanaugh's defense of it, saying this thing's existed forever. What's the big deal? And by the way, what is it? Because one thing that I really don't like in news media is when terms, technical terms or terms of art are tossed around and there's no explanation. So thank you, Julie, for asking us that. And I think we should have done it earlier, more in-depth elaboration, and your email prompts us. If you do have questions like Julie's, you can email me at corey.brettschneider@gmail.com. So Julie,
you can email me as well, but I probably won't know the answer. Although we have talked about shadow dockets a bit on the show, and I think everyone needs to be aware of it with this particular court. How does it differ from the regular Supreme Court process, and why does it matter?
Great. I mean, so one of the, and it's a subtle thing here, an attack on democracy that was really identified only a few years ago by Will Bode, a professor at the University of Chicago, who I'm lucky enough to know, a brilliant guy, who was just looking at this fact that sometimes the Supreme Court issues orders without any reasons. And what's weird about that, to begin with, is that the meaning of the court, the thing that makes it a court, as opposed to just a partisan body, is it has to give reasons for its decisions grounded in law. So every time it makes a decision in the usual course of things, it says, here's why. This is a violation of the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, or the First Amendment limits the government from doing X, Y, and Z. If it's an executive order or law passed by Congress, the court has the ability to hold up any statute or executive action against the Constitution, and in many cases, local action as well. And it has to say why. It has to give the past cases. It has to give an elaboration.
Right.
The shadow docket is just avoiding all that. It's just an order. It's just an emergency order, as they often put it,
Yeah.
that gives an answer. Now, why would they do that? And this is where Julie's question comes in. It's a phenomenon that has existed not longstanding. It's used occasionally before the first Trump term, but it's drastically increased during the first Trump term, and now we're really seeing a lot of it. And what does it do? It just evades the law. It's a way of the court making decisions without having to explain itself. And that's nothing less than turning the court into a purely partisan body. When
That's
Leah
right.
Littman on our podcast, a great interview, talked about the fact that this isn't really a court, that it's just a political body, that it's not acting on law, it's acting on vibes, as she so beautifully puts it. That's what she's really pointing to, their absence of reasons. And, they're not good at providing reasons. I think that's the other thing. If you don't have reasons, why provide them?
Well, that was what Kavanaugh tried to do this week. The justice publicly defended this use of emergency orders, but obviously it's pretty clear it's being abused, and that's coming from inside the court. His fellow justices have said that. But Corey, to play devil's advocate, what's the problem with issuing major decisions, sometimes life or death decisions, without a full briefing, without oral arguments? What's the problem with doing this without any public explanation?
It really goes to nothing less than the question of what a court is. Like, why do these justices think of the enormous power that they have? I just want to make sure listeners are following us. They have this power in the United States. It's controversial from the beginning of the Republic. The power of judicial review, to take any action by Congress, by a president, by local government, and say, is it constitutional or not, to hold it up against our fundamental written law, the Constitution of the United States. Now, the reason why they're thought to do that, and this goes back to a case called Marbury versus Madison, is because they're enforcing the law. They're not just saying, here's what I think, or here's how I feel, or let me help my partisan buddy, Donald Trump, or my partisan buddy, Joe Biden. If it was just that, well, then it would look like Congress. And also we would ask, like, why are we not voting for these people if it was just partisan? So it's supposed to be a system of law. And what's so horrible, frankly, about the shadow docket is that it really eliminates that burden of being a lawmaking body. And then you ask, well, why do they have this power in the first place?
Why do they? I mean, well, because, I mean, look at the role that the shadow dockets played in recent years. I mean, you made mention of this. Now, this is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, and it's always cases involving abortion rights or immigration or voting access. It just seems to sort of be a weaselly calling card for a court that doesn't want to have to justify its choices.
Yeah, accountability, I think if they were to have to reason it out, there's an embarrassment factor because so often the 5 or 6 justices, the dirty 6, as you've called them before, what are they doing? They're just making decisions based on, well, not precedent, certainly not in the abortion case where they just upend decades and decades of law and give some kind of lame answers. But we can see into it. We can see through it. People like me and you can sit there and read it and talk about it. And, that's a threat if what you're really doing is partisan politics. So the more they use it, the more the suspicion is this isn't law. And Justice Kagan, for instance, has called it out. Not surprisingly, Justice Kavanaugh, who has really from the beginning been a threat to democracy because of his belief in extreme executive power. Not surprisingly, if your role as a justice is to enable the destruction of democracy, you don't want to be caught doing it. So the shadow docket is a very convenient way to do it.
And is there any kind of reform that's possible here? I mean, could a Congress that wanted to mandate transparency, could a Congress that cared impose limits on the use of emergency decisions?
Well, that becomes a real challenge because if it was as simple as Congress passing a law saying, you got to give reasons, maybe that would solve it. But unfortunately, there's a limit on that. And it's the separation of powers. I mean, the separation of powers is a good thing, but it also prevents the kind of solutions that we need to this problem. And we don't want to get rid of the separation of powers. That's the point. But what the court would certainly say, I think, in the face of legislation that says, hey, you have to give your reasons, is they would say, don't tell us what to do. We are an independent branch, and Congress doesn't tell us how to make our decisions. So we need another solution, a more radical one, frankly. And that's under the guise of what is generally called court reform. That
Yeah.
might mean adding justices who are willing to, as Justice Kagan calls for, to give their reasons to engage in the process
Uh-huh.
of law, not in politics, and who would restore the fundamental rights under our Constitution, including the rights of privacy, the rights of due process that have been eviscerated by this president and this court. There are also creative solutions. There's life tenure for these justices. They can't just be fired, and I don't think impeachment is necessarily the way to go, although in Thomas's case, the corruption might call for it, but wouldn't get us to the
You'd
solution that
have
we
to
need.
care about corruption first. Yeah.
Yeah, but look, for instance, one proposal by Aziz Hook from University of Chicago Law School is to lower some of the justices to the circuit courts and elevate some of the other justices. That's a very interesting way to do it. So we've got to get creative here. We've got to figure out how to stop this assault on democracy, and part of that involves the requirement that we bring back a court that is willing to generally do law. And part of that means no emergency decisions to cover up what you're up to.
We got to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to return to one of my favorite subjects we ever discuss, and that is putting up the Ten Commandments on public school walls. Corey, people who don't believe in the Ten Commandments and don't follow the Ten Commandments and don't respect the Ten Commandments and vote for a man who's broken all 10 really think your kids should learn about the Ten Commandments. So let's talk about that when we return. This is The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office. I'm John Fugelsang. So, Corey, I love talking about the Ten Commandments, whether it's the Protestant version, the Hebrew version, the Catholic version, whichever one we want to fight on. I'm there for a good old fight about it. I think it's great that we don't want children to learn about LGBTQ identity, but we do want them to know that they shouldn't covet their neighbor's wife. This is I turn to government to teach religion to my children, and I always have. It's very important. Corey, Donald Trump has violated all 10 commandments. All 10. And I need to say that up front, okay? Because anybody who votes for Donald Trump doesn't believe in these things. They don't care about them. They don't respect them. I got to get it off the top of, off the bat. These people are full of crap. This is about power. This is about conservative Christian cultural domination. It's got nothing to do with the actual texts and scripture. I got to get that out of the way before we start. Because again, if you support Donald Trump, you don't take the Ten Commandments seriously. So just so we know, all these people we're dealing with are full of crap and they're blasphemers. Let's begin the conversation. And I'm sorry that I require this much of a disclaimer, but the court is likely, Corey, to weigh in again soon on the constitutionality of the Big Ten in the public schools. And given recent rulings, including Kennedy versus Bremerton, is it fair to think they really might overturn existing precedent?
Look, the Supreme Court is doing nothing less than assaulting the Constitution, and part of its assault on the Constitution is its assault on the first part of the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law establishing an official religion or respecting the establishment of religion. Let me say that again, sorry. The first part of the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And what that means is both that we can't have an official religion and that we can't have laws that relate to the establishment of religion. Now, taking the Ten Commandments and imposing it on a classroom, on kids, that is nothing less than, of course, the establishment of religion. And it flies in the face, the meaning of the Establishment Clause is to try to push back. It was ratified and passed in the 18th century when there still are concerns about the Crusades imposing religion on others. And that's the worry here, that what Trump is doing is destroying that fundamental idea. If you allow for the establishment of religion, it's closely related to the idea that you might limit the religion of others. And that is exactly, I think, what's going on in this kind of case. You asked about whether the court's going to uphold it. They have done so much to assault that fundamental idea
So
of
much.
religious freedom that, yes, I'm worried about it. I mean, John, on this one, I've got to throw it back to you because you have this amazing book coming out with Simon & Schuster. You can pre-order it now. It comes out in September.
Yes, pre-order.
I mean, what does the Ten Commandments have to do with the separation of church and hate?
I mean, what does the Ten Commandments have to do with following Jesus? He reduced the Ten Commandments to two. Again, it's a cudgel for these folks. It's a prop that they use. They like the Charlton Heston movie. Donald Trump doesn't follow these things. They don't follow these things. They don't live under post-Egypt Hebrew law. Leviticus doesn't apply to America. Leviticus doesn't apply to Christians. I love the Ten Commandments. I could talk about the Ten Commandments all day long. I could talk about Moses all day long. But again, we have to be mindful at all times. This is not about faith. This is not about religious freedom. This is about power. This is about conservative. It's not about Christian practice. Okay, they never complain in any way that their Christian practice of religion has been threatened or curtailed, because it never has been. It is conservative Christian domination of government, society, and culture. That's what they're angry about. So to me, I consider it all blasphemy, Professor, because they don't give a rat's ass about the Ten Commandments anymore than they give a rat's ass about Jesus. These things are props to Republicans, props to get more for me, 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 me. So, what you've written extensively on the Establishment Clause. I mean, you tell me, what's the historical and constitutional argument against government-sponsored religious displays in schools? I kind of thought we had settled this hundreds of times in the last 250 years.
And certainly, this is another area where the court did opine it on the 1980s. They definitely said very clearly it's a violation of the Establishment Clause to force the Ten Commandments into classrooms. And yet, this court again and again is rethinking things. They're undoing the Constitution right and left. And this is another area. Now, why are they doing it? I think they really reject the fundamental idea, not just of the First Amendment, but of our Constitution, which is that we reject theocracy. When I was talking about the Crusades, I mean, what is that but a theocratic imposition of religion by the use of force on others, and the imposition of religion? And this court doesn't seem to care that much about it. They seem to, if they're not Christian nationalists, to have a kind of sympathy with the rising Christian nationalism in this country, which sees America as fundamentally, and not just a Christian nation in the sense that we've had Christianity as part of our culture. Of course, that's true, but that it is Christianity that should be the principle that we use to impose on others. The idea of the First Amendment Establishment Clause is that you can talk in religious terms, have religious motivation for your own political beliefs. Of course, that's fine. And in many, many cases, think of Martin Luther King, think of all the points that you make all the time on this podcast and on Sirius XM. That's a great thing. It can motivate freedom, religion, and has over and over again. Think of the abolitionist movement, motivated, of course, in many ways by Christianity, but that's very different than theocracy, the idea that we should use some particular version of religion. And as you say, this isn't Christianity. It is this particular vision of it that is merged with theocracy, a warped vision of it, and impose it on others. And that's what the court is really opening the door to with this Ten Commandments case. Again and again, you might think like, oh, what's the big deal? The Ten Commandments aren't that bad. I've seen the movie, you know, these good ideas. But
Testament's great.
We've got to see it for what it is. It's the
imposition
of religion.
It's not about the Ten Commandments. It's about a broader push to redefine the wall between church and state in very narrow right-wing Christian nationalist terms. But what do you say, Corey, to critics who argue, oh, it's just a harmless tradition? What do you say, Professor, to the folks who say, oh, this is just valuable moral education?
You know, when I was a graduate student, I won't say the judge's name, but I was invited to a dinner hosted by a prominent conservative. I think everyone there at the dinner was conservative except for me. But it was one of these moments where you really get an insight. What the judge said is, you know, oh, we had a Christmas pageant at the show, and it was clearly not an inclusive Christmas pageant, and the Jews loved it. That was the way that she put it. And, you know, it's just an indifference to the idea that we are a society. And this is meant, I mean, I want to go back to the history here. George Washington is prevailed upon by the members of Toro Synagogue to answer this question. Are you going to have an official religion or not? Are you going to respect as equals members of all religions? And Washington, in a great letter back, makes it very clear. It's not just tolerance that he's talking about, not just mere tolerance, but it is respect for various religions as equals. That's the core of this clause. And it doesn't, far from excluding religion, it's meant to protect it. And then again and again, you know, we can't say too much that all religions have a way of rejecting theocracy, of embracing the fact that, yes, we have our own doctrine, but we embrace others as equals. And yet this idea of imposing the Ten Commandments is a way of rejecting that.
Absolutely. And again, it's got nothing to do with religious freedom. That's what it all comes back to for me. Corey, I love this topic. It's not going to go away. And I want to just close by saying you've spent your career teaching future leaders what the Constitution actually requires and why it matters. And we're looking at these stories here, and like, I mean, Trump's unprecedented firing of the head of Bureau of Labor Statistics for producing data he didn't like, this battle over the Ten Commandments displays in public schools, Kavanaugh's public defense of the emergency shadow dockets, Texas's astonishing gerrymandering plans. I mean, as all of this is going on, it seems like we're headed for much more deep and painful constitutional battles. So here's the $1 million question. What do you say to people who just feel like the system is rigged? That maybe Trump really is right, but except that he's rigged it and the oligarchs have always controlled it, the courts are lost, and democracy is slipping away. What is keeping you filled with hope, Professor?
Well, I think in each of these stories, there's a way to find the hope and the way to fight back. The first one I'll start with, we talked so much about truth, is simply by telling the truth. And that's what you and I do our best every week here on this podcast, on The Oath in the Office, is to just say things as they are and to give our views. And if we're confused about something or unsure of something, to say something, or if we see two sides to an issue and we're having trouble discerning, what the right to say that. And, often that's the case, but to not lie and to not manipulate the truth because you want an outcome. And that's what we're seeing from this president. So I actually think that one of the places to find hope is simply in telling the truth and in participating in conversations in which that's what you're committed to. And that's a big part. So my hope comes partly from these conversations, from hearing from our listeners as we keep getting this mail. And then, we could just keep going too. The partisan gerrymandering is, a blow. When we saw the Supreme Court say, we don't care about this, essentially, we give up on the Equal Protection Clause, that was a real worry for democracy. But yet, even in the midst of a crisis, we find a way of fighting back. And so the governors of California and New York are giving me that hope. You might not be a fan of Newsom or Hochul, but now you can see at least they are doing the right thing and not just laying down. And people are waking up to the fact that this is an ongoing self-coup, an attempt to destroy democracy. And these two leaders are starting to act in the way. On religion, John, I'm looking forward to your book, to these conversations, but my wife's family, who I just celebrated a reunion with, her grandfather was a minister in the liberal Baptist tradition, a tradition that unfortunately is largely disappearing. In my research for the Presidents and the People, I came across a lecture that Martin Luther King gave at the Louisville Seminary, where she talks about my wife's grandfather. That was a proud tradition of Christianity. And finding that, a lot of people claim they're connected to King, but to hear King talk about my wife's grandfather,
That's incredible.
grandfather of my daughter, is really a proud moment in our family. And, what I'll say is that tradition is still there, even if it's not as in the news as the form of Southern Baptists that have really turned to Christian nationalism. And the same is true of all religions. I know in the Catholic Church, of course, you're involved in many of those discussions, and we could go through all religions and do that. And so, yes, not allowing religion to be co-opted by Christian white nationalists, where the hope comes from. And so each of these issues, I think what we're doing is we're digging in, we're telling the truth as best we can, itself an act of hope. And then we're also, finding the alternatives. The truth is, we've always had two constitutions in this country. We've had an authoritarian constitution with presidents like Adams and Buchanan and Nixon, Woodrow Wilson, who have really tried to shut it down, who have tried to, in Wilson's case, bring about white nationalism, a project that almost succeeded. And we've had a democratic constitution, and it's come from, eventually it's been presidents who have taken up the cause of democracy, but it comes from citizens originally. And that's what we're doing here. That's the point of these conversations. Politics begins with talking.
I want to thank you, Professor, for having me for this podcast. I want to thank Wendy and Beowulf and everybody who puts it together. And I want to thank all of our listeners. Please, if you don't subscribe already, hit that thing and subscribe and give us a review. And you can always write to us with your questions or your jokes or your thinly veiled threats. We'd love to hear from them. And Corey, what's the best way for our listeners to follow you outside of the podcast?
Well, you can find me as Democracy Prof on Blue Sky, and so glad to engage with conversations with listeners there. Of course, The Oath in the Office now has a YouTube channel, and if you want to watch us in addition to listening to us, you can. And I've just put up a series of videos that I'll elaborate more on next time, but you can start checking them out. Two of them are filmed at Trump Tower in the center of I don't know what you want to call it, Devil's Cauldron, where we talk about the escalator that he came down, how he promised racism and why it's delivered. And so these videos are a way of promoting the podcast. If you like them, share them, check them out. And John, what a pleasure to do this every
Always
week.
a pleasure.
We
Thank you.
have some amazing guests coming up too, which I'll start mentioning as we go forward.
Right on. Thank you, Corey. I'm on Sirius XM Progress every night. You could hear that as a free podcast the next day, every day. My book comes out September 9th. It's called Separation of Church and Hate. I want to thank you, Professor, and all of our listeners. And just remember, if it feels like we've beaten up on the Republicans, they want to do nothing about mass shootings. They want to do nothing about gun violence. They want to do nothing about climate change. They want to do nothing about income inequality. But at least they're going to do something about these damn paper straws, and I salute them for it. They're on it. Thank you all so much. We will see you next time on The Oath and The Office.